Becoming is aspirational. So I have a question for you this morning. Who do you want to be when you grow up? Not what do you want to be when you grow up, but who? I've answered that question in different ways at different times in my life. Maybe you have too. When I was in my 20s, I wanted to be Helen Thompson when I grew up, the ageless, can do anything camp director I worked with. In my 30s, I wanted to be Rebecca Parker when I grew up, a Unitarian Universalist minister whose words never fail to illumine and inspire. In my 50s, I wanted to be Kate Mars when I grew up, our beloved church member who never lacked for energy or positive outlook. Maybe you wanted to be Kate Mars too when you grew up. Now that I'm in my 60s, I want to be myself when I grow up. It will take the rest of my life to get there because becoming who we aspire to be is a lifelong process. And it's not linear. Anais Nin wrote, "We do not grow absolutely chronologically. We grow sometimes in one dimension and not in another, unevenly. We grow partially. We are relative. We are mature in one realm and childish in another. The past, present, and future mingle and pull us backward, forward, or fix us in the present. We are made of layers, cells, constellations." Constellations. Much has been said about the process of becoming an adult, how and when it happens, and what markers show that you've become one. Sociologists notice a changing timetable for adulthood and name people between the age of 18 and 25 as emerging adults. The economy, incidentally, has a lot to do with this. The 2008 recession, the high cost of post-secondary education, a heavy load of debt, and rising cost of housing impact available choices for emerging adults. 1 in 3 people in the millennial generation live with their parents. Outer markers of adulthood, like marriage and childbearing, are happening later. The verb adulting was Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year in 2016. Adulting refers to certain behaviors that show fleeting appearances of being an adult before a young person lapses back into, well, not acting like a responsible adult. I suppose that happens to all of us now and then, but emerging adults seem to use the term adulting the most. Professor of psychology and behavioral economics, Dan Ariely, said it is hard for young adults to prioritize their future selves when there are no traditional milestones anymore. Adulting means they temporarily act like adults, but don't feel like adults. They temporarily act like adults when they sign an apartment lease, do their taxes, buy renter's insurance, pay down a college loan, and they might post of these events. Adulting today. Siri Demanda said the scope and uncertainty of being an adult in the 21st century leaves young people with a pervading existential anxiety that you can grow up without knowing how to be an adult. But of course, this depends on our social location. In her article, The White Privilege of Adulting, Vina Moore critiques the notion of adulting by pointing out that children of color, and particularly low-income children of color, take on basic tasks of managing a household early in life and, by necessity, develop adult-like survival skills. Due to parents working long hours, Black girls in particular are very likely to be adultified, she wrote, becoming the cook and the maid for their household. She said the term adulting exalts men and white people for doing the bare minimum. I can see her point. I wonder, when did you feel like you became an adult? What were the signs or markers that caused you to feel that way? I remember feeling like an adult when I got my first full-time job, my first apartment, and strangely enough, when I bought my first couch. It was only a futon couch with a frame that could open into a bed, but I was very impressed with myself. Somehow I thought that my parents would start viewing me as an adult when I showed them my new couch. They had been very impressed when my older sister and her new husband bought their first official living room furniture. But my futon couch did not have the same effect. I was disappointed until I noticed that my couch was placed in an apartment and not a house. I had dropped out of college, was working a non-career type job, and I was not married or planning to have children. There were not enough traditional markers of adulthood around my couch. And well, it was a futon. In the anthology, Wrestling with Adulthood, Unitarian Universalist Men Talk About Growing Up, Ken Belden wrote, for many men, young adulthood, roughly age 18 to 35, is a time of exchanges, of negotiations between various identities. School is often replaced by work. One's home of origin is replaced by a home of one's creation. And at the same time, men in these years often begin to find greater focus, exchanging the relative freedom of youth for the security and constancy of one particular mate and one particular profession. It is a stage when a young man buckles down, puts away some of his childhood dreams, and accepts the realities of life. Sometimes this transition occurs without serious crisis or complaint, he continues. But sometimes the shift between identities is not smooth. The professional identity doesn't materialize. A new geographical location never seems like home, or a significant relationship does not fulfill its promise. In those cases, the deliverance into another identity can seem like emotional exile, kind of spiritual homelessness in which you can't go back, and yet you're not sure where you're headed. Many people in their 20s and early 30s in our culture, he wrote, face a time of letting go, saying goodbye to well-established ways of relating to the world. They emerge into new patterns of relationship, sometimes with enthusiasm, sometimes with concern. As in so many transitional moments, there is much grief in the farewells of young adulthood. It can be a lonely time. The ties that bind can be pulled in so many directions. They fail to hold tight. Pulled too far or too quickly, they may snap altogether. Belden's anthology, Wrestling with Adulthood, was published in 2008. The wrestling match with adulthood has only intensified during the pandemic. A recent Time magazine article, The Lost Year, How the Pandemic Changed a Generation of Students, reports many high school seniors are isolated from friends, teachers, and counselors, and are taking on extra jobs or caregiving roles at home to help their families. In this lonesome environment, they're expected to plan their post-graduation future. In Miami, Othniel Roden was on track to be the first in his family to attend college this fall. But the 18-year-old senior at Booker T. Washington Senior High School grew discouraged after a year of not seeing friends or being able to pursue his passions. This pandemic has really killed my ambition for school and other stuff I had a passion for, said Roden, a participant in First Star, a nonprofit that helps students in foster care apply to college. It's like part of me is missing, he said. Lindsay C. Wilson, the CEO of First Star, says there was a drop in the program's class of 2020 students who went on to 2-year or 4-year colleges, and an increase in those who instead took jobs or joined the military. It's incredibly worrisome, she says, if the numbers continue to play out the way that they are, we're going to have a lot more young people working for jobs that aren't providing a living wage. This becomes more important when you look at the long game. According to a Georgetown University report, a growing number of jobs now require a post-secondary degree, and nearly all jobs created during the recovery from the Great Recession went to workers with at least some college education. Americans with just a high school diploma face higher rates of unemployment and earn $7,000 to $26,000 less each year than those with an associate's or bachelor's degree. Ellen Payton, a college and career readiness teacher in Marks, Mississippi, worries the pandemic will create a generation of students who don't get the opportunities they deserve. She said, these are young adults and they're coming into their place in society. This is a big change in their life and it has the ability to make or break their future. Here is a question from our theme circle packet this month. Are you the person now that you thought you'd be when you were in your teens? And if you are in your teens right now, are you the person you thought you'd be when you were a child? An article called How Your Personality Changes as You Age by Zaria Gorvit says, our personalities were long thought to be fixed by the time we reached our 30s. But the latest research suggests they change throughout our lives and bring some surprising benefits. After decades of research into the effects of aging, scientists are uncovering another, more mysterious change. The conclusion is exactly this, that we are not the same person for the whole of our life, says Renee Modis, a psychologist from the University of Edinburgh. Most of us would like to think of our personalities as relatively stable throughout our lives, but research suggests this is not the case. Our traits are ever shifting, and by the time we're in our 70s and 80s, we've undergone a significant transformation. And while we are used to thinking of aging in terms of deterioration and decline, the gradual modification of our personalities has some surprising upsides. We become more conscientious and agreeable and less neurotic. Who knew? Research has shown that we develop into more altruistic and trusting individuals. Our willpower increases, and we develop a better sense of humor. People become more socially adapted. They're increasingly able to balance their own expectations of life with societal demands. Psychologists call the process of change that occurs as we age personality maturation. Personality maturation. It's a gradual, imperceptible change that begins in our teenage years and continues into at least our 8th decade on the planet. Should we live so long? Intriguingly, it seems to be universal. The trend is seen across all human cultures. It's important that we know this, says Rhoda Damian, a social psychologist at the University of Houston. We're seeing that our personalities can adapt, and this helps us to cope with the challenges that life throws at us. Forrest Gilmore writes in Wrestling with Adulthood, there is a basic truth that every spiritual traveler knows. Death happens more than once in our lives. These small d deaths occur when we feel the deep inner pull of our psyches calling us to let go of who we've been in order to more fully become who we are. This recurring journey of transformation has a name: positive disintegration. Positive disintegration basically means that every form of life must at some point shed its current form in order to evolve into a new and hopefully more adaptable form. There are many positive disintegrations that occur in our lives: puberty, leaving the family home, the entry into vocation, marriage, parenthood, the death of parents, and retirement. Rites of passage theory affirms 3 major transitions in a person's life: from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence to adulthood, from adulthood to elderhood. While these stages are all profoundly important, the shift to adulthood has been especially emphasized for the health of society. While childhood and adolescence are both appropriately focused on the self, adulthood is a time of offering oneself in service to the larger whole. The adult is the source of life for the culture, the one who provides for people so that they may live. Without the adult, the community falls apart. Well, I've thrown a lot of material at you today that adds up to one of my foundational beliefs about the reason for faith communities: to support each other's maturation throughout our lives, including and primarily our spiritual maturation. In his book, Falling Upward, Richard Rohr claims there are different tasks for the 2 halves of human life, and that our failings are as important as our achievements. He writes, the first task of life is to build a strong container or identity. The second is to find the contents that the container was meant to hold. The first half of life is discovering the script, and the second half is actually writing it and owning it. We are a first half of life culture, he continues, largely concerned about surviving successfully. We all try to do the first task of life, establish an identity, a home, relationships, friends, community, security, and building a platform for our life. But it takes us much longer to discover the task within the task, what we are really doing when we are doing what we are doing. Shall I say that again? It takes us much longer to discover the task within the task, what we are really doing when we are doing what we are doing. It is when we begin to pay attention, he says, and seek integrity precisely in the task within the task, that we begin to move from the first to the second half of our own lives. Integrity largely has to do with growing honest about our actual motives and intentions. It is hard work. Most often, we don't pay attention to that inner task until we have had some kind of fall or failure in our outer tasks. Life, if we are honest about it, is made up of many failings and fallings amidst all of our hopeful growing and achieving. When I say, he wrote, that you will enter the second half of life, I don't mean it in a strictly chronological way. Some young people, especially those who have learned from early suffering, are already there. And some older folks are still quite childish. None of us go into our spiritual maturity completely of our own accord or by a totally free choice, but we are led by mystery. The most counterintuitive message in most of the world's religions is that we grow spiritually much more by doing it wrong than by doing it right. By denying their pain, avoiding the necessary falling, many have kept themselves from their own spiritual depths and therefore have been kept from their own spiritual heights. The human ego prefers anything, just about anything, to falling or changing or dying. It takes a foundational trust to fall or to fail and not to fall apart. In conclusion, let me return to my opening question. Who do you want to be when you grow up? Not what, but who? We have a chance to ask ourselves that question throughout our lives, perhaps especially after we fall or fail. How can we help each other in the process of becoming so that we and our communities may live, so that we and our communities may live and thrive? The truth is, I've always wanted to become myself when I grew up. Aspiring to be like my role models has helped me become more of the person I want to be. Poet May Sarton wrote, "Now I become myself. It's taken time, many years and places. I have been dissolved and shaken, worn other people's faces, run madly as if time were there, terribly old, crying a warning. Hurry, you will be dead before..." What? Before you reach the morning? Or the end of the poem is clear? Or love safe in the walled city? Now, to stand still, to be here, feel my own weight and density. The black shadow on the paper is my hand. The shadow of a word as thought shapes the shaper falls heavy on the page, is heard. All fuses now, falls into place from wish to action, word to silence. My work, my love, my time, my face, gathered into one intense gesture of growing like a plant. As slowly as the ripening fruit, fertile, detached, and always spent, falls, but does not exhaust the root. So all the poem is, can give, grows in me to become the song, made so and rooted by love. Now there is time, and time is young. Oh, in this single hour I live, all of myself, and do not move. I, the pursued, who madly ran, stand still, and stop the sun.